Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. It is a pleasure to see you. Now you can see me. I'm Hari-kirtana. Thank you very much for joining me. For those who are new to the webinar, please raise your hand if you can hear me. There's a little hand raising icon that should be in the lower right hand corner for you. So I see no hands. Ah, there we go. Shanna, thank you very much for raising your hand. Now, I won't rest until I see everyone raise their hand to confirm that they can in fact hear me. Can't hear you. All right, let's see. How about now? Can you hear me now? One of you cannot hear me. So please double check your all right. So if you're having adjust your audio settings. Let's see our participants. Okay, because my mic is unmuted and my volume is up. And now I will ask you questions. Okay. Raise hands if you can hear me. Ah, okay, now we've got a bunch of raised hands. All right. Thea, how about you? All right, let's try. Just all of you, thank you very much. You can all lower your hands. Just want to make sure that everyone's got. So adjusting your audio settings, just double check your audio settings, make sure that they're okay. Restarting the webinar sometimes also does it. And Casey, Jess, Jill, Shannon, Susan, and everyone, thank you so much for being here. I am so happy to see you. And now you know how to raise your hands if you're new to the webinar, and hopefully we have overcome any technical difficulties that we might have had. And I welcome all of you who are checking in as we're getting started. My name is Hari-kirtana Das, and assuming now that you have adjusted your audio settings, don't worry about your microphone or video camera. Your audio settings in terms of projecting sound, not to worry. You can see me and hear me, hopefully. I cannot see or hear you. Your viewing options are also adjustable in the right-hand corner. And if you have a question at any time, please type it into the Q&A. Casey, would you do me the honor of just testing out the Q&A box? Type something in there just to make sure that that's working for you. And while I am waiting for something to be typed in, we'll take a quick look at last week's webinar. The Art of Sacrifice, Action Without Reaction, the very pivotal verse that explains how one can act in the world without generating a reaction. We looked at what might pass for primitive mythology in the Bhagavad-gita and gave what I hope is a rational explanation for how that might not be quite as primitive as it may sound. May the force be with you, Mr. Spock. Mixing metaphors and speaking about how we can get the laws of nature, or more specifically, the lawmakers of nature, to cooperate with us. We covered Chapter 3, verses 9 through 15. Tonight, we will continue with the art of sacrifice. We'll look at how we participate in the cycles of nature, the wheel of nature that is made to turn by sacrifice. We will speak about independent action, or to be more specific, how one becomes independent in their action, who is actually independent in their actions, action for the benefit of others, providing an example. And we will cover chapter 3, verses 16 through 20. So a relatively short segment of verses that are grouped together in this section. Okay. So, as is our usual habit, or at least my usual habit, I'll read all of the verses straight through in this section, and then we will look at each individual verse and go deeper into the significance of that particular verse. Before we do that, though, let's review, because the first verse that we start with in this section references the verse that went before it. So for the sake of context, I'll go back to that verse. That was verse 15 in the 3rd chapter, which reads, "Prescribed duties are described in the sacred literature, the Vedas, and sacred literature originates in the imperishable absolute, the sound vibration Om. Therefore, the all-pervading absolute is eternally situated in acts of sacrifice." The idea that by making your actions an offering to something greater than yourself, one accesses a higher level of the experience of a broader range of reality. Kind of radical proposition. In the Yoga Sutras, we find the idea of making an offering to the Supreme Person, Ishvara Pranidhana. In this section, we're stepping it down to address sacrifice offered to those beings who are agents of the Supreme Being and are specially empowered to control elements of material nature. Kind of a wild proposition. So now we begin with the translation of the first verse of what we're covering this evening. So this is verse 16. "Thus, the cycle of sacrifice is set into motion, O my dear Partha, Arjuna. One who does not keep this cycle turning, who lives an irresponsible life in pursuit of sense pleasure, lives in vain." Text 17. "However, for one who takes pleasure in the self, whose satisfaction and contentment are found exclusively in the self, for that person there is no duty that needs to be fulfilled." 18. "Such a person has nothing to gain by acting, no reason to refrain from acting, and no sense of dependence on anyone for any purpose." Text 19. "Therefore, act as a matter of duty, without attachment to the results of your actions, for by acting without attachment, one surely attains the highest perfection." Text 20. "Indeed, by proper action alone, kings like Janaka attained perfection. If for no other reason you are obliged to act, if for no other reason You are obliged to act for the welfare of the world. Proof once again that punctuation matters. Okay. Those are our verses. And now we'll slow it down and look at each of these verses in some detail. So back to 3:16. Thus, the cycle of sacrifice is set into motion, Arjuna. One who does not keep this cycle turning, who lives an irresponsible life in pursuit of sense pleasure, lives in vain. This section of the Gita is kind of a harsh toke section. You know, it's a little bit of a buzzkill. If our lives up until this point have been primarily lived in pursuit of sense pleasure, which is actually what everybody does. That's the nature of material life, is that you have a material body, which is the coherent organization of a set of material senses. And at the very least, they have basic primal needs that we have to fulfill just in order to survive. Thank you, Maslow. And then beyond basic survival, in material consciousness, there's really nothing more than eat, drink, and be merry, or maybe on a little higher level, live peacefully, prosper. That's our definition of happiness, is to be healthy and prosperous. I know when I speak to the older members of my family, they want to know how I'm doing. And what they are actually asking, are you healthy? Are you prosperous? And are you happy? Those are the three things that material life is concerned with. They want the best for me, but it doesn't really occur to them, because they're just not oriented this way, to ask me if I've made progress in my spiritual life, if I'm any closer to understanding who I really am, what the world really is. And if I tell them that, well, seeking happiness through the acquisition of wealth and trying to maintain one's health forever is not possible, and therefore not a source of sustainable happiness, that will just be confusing. And it'll be consistent because I have confused them my entire life. So they won't actually be surprised, at least not in my case. We're going to talk a little bit more about how one goes about the pursuit of spiritual life without confusing people next week. So a little foreshadowing there. Meanwhile, there's this idea that, now these verses right here, this verse in particular, is actually addressing the issue of how you live in the material world. That is to say, how you do maintain your health, how you become prosperous, and how you become happy within the limited context of a temporary life that involves the enjoyment of the senses. But there's a way to do it. Karma actually means good karma in context. There's another word for bad karma, vikarma. Karma means action that's in harmony with cosmic order, and naturally that brings about happiness, harmonious living tends to be happy. And part of that cosmic order is this cycle. A wheel is made to turn. The Sanskrit word that's used here is chakra, or wheel. So a wheel is made to turn. A cycle is set in motion by this exchange of making an offering to those sub-deities, let's say, demigods, who are in charge of material nature. Now, one of those demigods is the earth herself, Mother Bhumi. And we are enjoined to keep that cycle of offering sacrifice, receiving gifts in return going. We spoke a little bit about this last week. The sun shines, the rain falls, the wind blows, food grows out of the land. We don't invent the sun. We can't control the rain. The seeds are products of nature. And when we try to take over for nature and engineer this stuff ourselves, we end up with food that has no prana, food that has no energy, no life force to it. You can't manufacture life force. We can engineer stuff that has the facsimile of the life force, that looks like life-giving nutrients in the form of synthetic vitamins and minerals, and Monsanto wants to control our whole food production with frankenfood. And none of that stuff is good for you. Nor will it ever be good, because you can't manufacture the life force that is delivered to our material bodies through the agency of natural food, which depends on Mother Nature and the forces of nature. So the idea of being a steward of the earth, the idea of making an offering of what you do, giving a portion of the gifts you receive back, the expression of gratitude, it's just good manners. Whereas to take a gift without so much as saying thank you, it's rude. To say nothing of the current state of affairs, which is that those who do not keep this cycle turning and who live an irresponsible life in pursuit of sense pleasure live in vain. Which is to say that the whole undertaking of trying to control material nature simply for the sake of exploiting the resources of material nature for sense pleasure is a big, fat, stupid waste of time, and will only come back to bite us when the earth, dissatisfied with how we are treating her, starts to act up to let us know about her dissatisfaction. Hence, we have out of control forest fires, hurricanes that are far more severe than they normally are and stick around for longer. I think you get the idea. So the prosperity of the world depends not just on our own efforts, but on a background arrangement of cosmic order that ultimately rolls up to the Supreme Person who deputizes other especially empowered beings to run the management of the universe. And if we want the universe to cooperate with us, then we have to have good manners, at the very least. In the next verse, there we go. No, not yet. Okay. The next verse, 17, we now step up from just karma to what's called nishkama karma yoga. We start to talk about a person who is not so preoccupied with material sense enjoyment because they are engaged in the process of pratyahara, turning the senses inward and seeking pleasure in the self within, rather than the exteriors of the objects of the senses, that which the material senses pursue for the purpose of enjoyment. So again, this verse is, however, for one who takes pleasure in the self, whose satisfaction and contentment are found exclusively in the self, for that person there is no duty that needs to be fulfilled. So earlier in our webinar series, I spoke about a verse that makes a distinction between the introspective sage, who really doesn't get all that excited about the stuff that a materialist thinks is very exciting and interesting and fun, and really gets jazzed about the inner journey, the inner adventure that looks to those who are engaged in material life as doing nothing, boring. So a person who is actually experiencing the pleasure of self-realization is called Atma Rama. Rama means bliss, Atma means the self. So one who is experiencing the bliss of turning inward to experience the self as the self truly is. And remember, there are three components of spirit: eternality, knowledge, complete cognition, and perfect feeling or bliss. So someone who's starting to tap into that, they don't have any actual obligation with regard to this sacrifice. So somebody who is pursuing the objects of the senses in the material world, they require some purification by participating in this cycle of sacrifice. And the idea is to gradually experience an elevation of consciousness that inspires one to make this inward turn towards the self. And if the performance of the sacrifice is not resulting in that inspiration to turn inward, then what you're really dealing with is moral codes that don't rise to the level of yoga. So what Krishna is doing here is encouraging Arjuna not to just limit himself to thinking in terms of moral codes, but rather to transcend those moral codes, to go beyond those moral codes, to an internal experience of yoga that happens simultaneously, that works simultaneously with the external action of his social duty. So he's not saying do nothing, as we hear in the next verse. Such a person, this now 18, such a person has nothing to gain by acting, meaning no material gain, no selfish motive, not feeling compelled to act because one doesn't aspire for the fruits of action, detachment from any material result. No reason to refrain from acting either. So what this means is that one who is turning inward, making this inner journey, is not obliged to renounce the world and go off into some reclusive contemplative practice. Now, this is not to say that you shouldn't engage in a reclusive contemplative practice. There's great value in that kind of practice. For most of us, we're not going to sustain a full-time, 24/7 reclusive contemplative practice. We're going to engage with the world. We have responsibilities to family members. We have responsibilities to society. We have responsibilities to other people in our lives. It's our nature to be active, not necessarily our nature. And Arjuna's nature is to be active. He's thinking that he should go off to the forest and become a contemplative yogi. And he's not yet convinced, by the way, that that isn't what he should do. It will take some more convincing on Krishna's part, several chapters actually. Krishna is starting to make the argument that the inner journey does not oblige one to cease acting, to desist from acting in the world. So you don't have a reason not to act, double negative. Nor, continuing with the verse, and no sense of dependence on anyone for any purpose. So the Atmarama, one who is experiencing the bliss of self-knowledge, is free to act completely independently or not act, as the case may be, whatever circumstances dictate. One can withdraw the senses and turn inward when that seems like the right thing to do. One can take that inner experience out into the world when action is required. And in Arjuna's case, action is required. And in our case as well, action is more likely than not required. So what is the motivation for action? Well, one motivation is whether an action will be spiritual beneficial to others or not. If the action is a spiritual benefit to others, then we act. If there's no spiritual benefit, then one who is on the path of yoga may not feel so motivated to act because their prime motivation is spiritual advancement for themselves and for others. Whether the action increases the spiritual experience of the yogi, of the Atmarama, such as hearing and chanting about the Supreme Person. That is the kind of activity that the devotional yogi finds particularly inspiring. Just looking ahead, Krishna will confirm this as being a source of joy for those who are wise. That's the way he puts it. He describes those who truly understand his position and the nature of the relationship between the individual self and the Supreme Self in this way. Such a person, with their thoughts dwelling in me, and every breath of life offered to me, Ishvara Pranidhana. Those who are devoted to me experience complete satisfaction and transcendental bliss by continually enlightening one another and speaking about me. So this is the 9th verse from the 10th chapter of the Bhagavad-gita. So this would be characterized as a purely spiritual action. And that kind of spiritualization of action can take place in all manner of other activities. That is to say, we can dovetail our natural inclinations in such a way as to spiritualize them. All right. So we'll stop here for just a second to see if anyone has any question or comment. So please type any question or comment you may have in the Q&A box, which I will keep my eye on. The next verse that we're going to go to is the verse that we will chant responsively, call and response chanting, as we routinely do in our webinars. So this verse is Krishna's conclusion Oh, I'm sorry. We had a question a little while back, and I was actually looking at the wrong box. So my apologies for missing your question. Shanna would like to know, so the Atman is the same thing as the self. Yes. The Sanskrit word Atma or Atman, same thing, has different meanings according to the way it's used, because Sanskrit is a very contextual language, and sometimes that can be very confusing. The most fundamental meaning is the self. Now, here's where there's two ways that this gets confusing. There's a good example of this in Graham Schwegg's translation of the Bhagavad-gita. There's one verse in the Bhagavad-gita where the word Atman is used several times, but the context of the verse is such that it doesn't always mean the self. That verse goes, one should uplift the self by the mind rather than degrade oneself by the mind, in a nutshell. Professor Schwag chose to translate every use of the word Atman as self, which results in one should uplift the self by the self and not degrade the self by the self in order for the self to transcend the self, or something along those lines. Anyway, you get the idea. Sometimes Atman will refer to the mind, sometimes Atman will refer to the body. It really depends on the context. So in case you ever come across a verse like that, consider that Atman means the self, but it can also mean other things depending on the context in which it is used. Now, here's the other place, and for me, the more significant place where this gets confusing. In your question, you put a capital S on the self, which could indicate that the self we're talking about is not the individual self, but the supreme self. There is Atman, the self with a lowercase s, and there is Param Atman. So if you look at the screen, the first word of the last line of this verse, verse 19 in the 3rd chapter, begins with the word Param, which means supreme. We'll translate this in just a moment. There is a common interpretation of the Bhagavad-gita and other yoga texts that says that the individual Atman, or the self with the lowercase s, only exists in material consciousness and is ultimately illusory. The individual consciousness, when it becomes self-realized, realizes that it is actually the self with an uppercase S, or the supreme person. And that requires that the supreme person could come under the influence of illusion somehow, which might make one question the supremacy of the supreme person. But it certainly goes against the grain of the first instruction we hear in the Bhagavad-gita. Krishna tells Arjuna, "Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings assembled on the battlefield, nor in the future is there any possibility that any of us will ever cease to be." So in this very first instruction, he confirms that we are eternally individual sparks of consciousness, that our individuality is eternal, or that we are eternal individuals in a spiritual sense, not just in a material sense, because he's clearly making a distinction between the eternal person within the temporary material body and the temporary material body. So he must be speaking about the eternal spiritual individual rather than the temporary material body. You will see this kind of philosophical overlay on the Gita time and time again. So it's a very easy mistake to make, to think that the lowercase Atman is the uppercase self, because it's often translated in that way and certainly commented in that way. But the Bhagavad-gita itself, if you just take a direct reading of the text, does not support this kind of interpretive translation. There is a distinction between Atman and Paramatman, the individual consciousness and the infinite consciousness. So therefore, your question, if I'm to answer it the way you wrote it, so the Atman is the same thing as the self, I would actually say no. Even though the word means self, it is not the uppercase S. Now you put I just noticed now you put a capital A on Atman. So if you're talking about the supreme Atman, therefore the capital A, as the supreme self with a capital S, then the answer is yes. But there are two categories of selves in the Bhagavad-gita, as there are in the Yoga Sutras: the lowercase self and the uppercase self, or the individual Purusha and the Purusha Vishesha in the Yoga Sutras. The Purushas like you and I, and the Purusha Vishesha, the one exceptional Purusha. Okay, so yours says, and Casey, I got you, I'm coming, don't go away. Yours says, but when a man has found delight and satisfaction and peace in the Atman, which I assume you have written the capital A in Atman, and here's how you could actually interpret this two ways. So with the capital A on Atman, if one has turned the senses inward, the mystic yoga process is one of meditating on the Supreme Person. That will be described later in the Bhagavad-gita and is described in the Yoga Sutras. The process for achieving the perfection of samadhi, or the perfection of yoga, is to meditate on the Supreme Person, Ishvara, by way of the sound vibration Om. And one who has actually realized that Atman with a capital A, or the Param Atman, the Supreme Atman, would certainly find delight and satisfaction, because there is no greater joy, even beyond the joy of experiencing oneself in pure consciousness or Brahman realization, is the joy of Paramatma realization, the vision of the Supreme Person within one's own heart, turning inwards to find that Supreme Person. So yes, that would be a true statement. The mistake one might make is to misidentify that Supreme Atman within the heart as one's own self. And that would be different. Yes, the divine within. And the absolute non-dualistic way of looking at it is to think, oh, that's me. I am the Supreme Being. In which case now you have to ask, well, then how did you forget? It seems odd that a Supreme Being would forget something like that. Whereas for a relationship to be there, you have to have two people. And so to experience the relationship of the Atman to the Param Atman, now you need two. So yes, to experience the divine, or to experience the Supreme Person, the Supreme Divinity within, and therefore have an experience of the divine, yes, that would be a source of delight and satisfaction and peace, in keeping with this description right here. So thank you very much for asking this very excellent question and sharing your translation. All right. Okay, Casey asks, is it ever valuable to translate only one? It seems that it is taken out of context without reading the previous and latter verses. Yes, you are absolutely right. And of course, you are jumping in to our webinar and honoring me by your presence for the first time. If it seems like jumping into the middle of a text and just taking it out of context and looking at it all by its lonesome means that there is loss of information or meaning, you are absolutely right. The Bhagavad-gita verses are meant to be understood in context. So the clusters of verses that I am taking are verses that all relate to one another. But those clusters relate to the clusters of verses on either side of them, and so on and so on. So it's kind of like Russian dolls. The verses fit within clusters of verses, fit within clusters of verses, fit within clusters of verses. So you're absolutely right. I do not recommend simply reading a verse by itself minus the context. Now, you can look at a verse and go deep into that verse and find how that verse relates to your life. The verse itself may stop you. If you are engaged in contemplative reading, then something about one particular verse may just stop you and you have to think about it. You have to hang out with it in order to really develop a relationship with it. However, the value of hanging out with one translated verse at a time does not negate the importance of seeing that verse in the context of the verses that surround it. For example, I gave I referenced Krishna's first instruction to Arjuna in terms of establishing the eternal individuality of a spiritual being. Well, there's a verse right before that where there's a setup. Krishna tells Arjuna, you're speaking learned words, you sound like you know what you're talking about, but actually you're a fool because you are lamenting for that which is unworthy of your lamentation. And I've seen people take that verse out of context and try to figure out, what does that mean? Well, you don't have to figure out what it means or why you need not grieve for that which is unworthy of lamentation, because the very next verse tells you the reason why Krishna tells Arjuna that his grief is misplaced, because Arjuna is grieving for those he thinks who are about to die, and you can't kill anyone. You can only kill their bodies. And that's the distinction that Krishna makes. So yes, thank you very much for your questions. It is valuable to hang out with one translated verse at a time for the sake of going deeper into that verse. However, that doesn't mean you should simply extract that verse from its context in order to understand its meaning. So thank you very much. All right, we try to be helpful. Okay, here we go. We're going to chant this verse 19 from the 3rd chapter, and I will do this one line at a time. I will chant it, and then you will chant back. Here we go. Tasmada sakta sattatam karyam karma samachara asakto hyacharan karma param apnoti purushaha. So just a quick note on the marks, the diacritics that give you the pronunciation cues for those of you who may be chanting with us for the first time, not familiar with these pronunciation cues. The bar over a vowel indicates a very long and open sound as opposed to a short sound and somewhat more closed sound. The dot over a vowel, like an M or underneath an M, indicates closure in both front and back. Kind of a nasal sound when you make the M sound. C's are CH sounds. If you want a K sound, you get a K. If you want an S sound, you get an S. The C is used for a ch sound. So we have samachara, acharan. The Y is flow at the end of a word, in a short word like he, actually flows directly into the next word, hyacharan. And then the dot under the H at the end of the last word, purushaha, the dot indicates that you echo the vowel that precedes the H back. So it's not just purusha, but purushaha, as in shanti, shanti, shantihi. All three shantis have the dot under the H, but only the last one is pronounced because it's at the end of the line. So that's the rule for that. The translation for this verse: therefore, act as a matter of duty without attachment to the results of your actions, for by the acting without attachment, one surely attains the highest perfection. Well, you can get rid of the by the acting. I sound like a character from Taxi. By acting without attachment, one surely attains the highest perfection. Okay. So, the highest perfection, what is the highest perfection? We just discussed how there are different understandings of yoga and different schools of yoga philosophy that indicate different ultimate objectives. So one who is on the path of liberation, who wants to give up one's spiritual individuality and merge into the undifferentiated oneness of Brahman. Brahman being the light of pure spiritual energy, the force. One who wants to merge into this clear light of pure spiritual energy can do so, and for them, that is the highest perfection. For one who wants to see divinity within one's heart, the supreme person residing within the heart, then attaining the vision of this Param Atma would be the highest perfection. For one who wants to engage in a relationship of love with the Supreme Person, then Bhagavan, the personal form of the Supreme Divinity, would be the highest perfection. So you can apply this idea of highest perfection to any of the paths of yoga. So here Krishna is encouraging Arjuna to fight, not just act, but to fight as a matter of duty without attachment to the results. Arjuna's problem is his attachment to the results, because when he looks at what's about to go down and thinks about all the possible ways that it can turn out, it's all bad. Every possible scenario is a lose-lose scenario. And he doesn't want this to be, not just for himself, but for everyone concerned, everyone on the battlefield and the rest of society off the battlefield who will be adversely affected by this battle simply by virtue of it taking place. We see this right now. There's a battle taking place in Yemen. This is now hitting the news as an imminent humanitarian crisis in a situation that was already a humanitarian crisis. And now, just because a battle is taking place and a port of entry through which humanitarian aid has been entering will be shut down, then people beyond the battlefield, the non-combatants, will experience an increase in their suffering. So simply by virtue of the battle taking place, Arjuna understands that bad things will happen. And what Krishna is telling him, and this is part of the harsh talk portion of the program, is that it's his duty to fight, irrespective of the outcome. And he needs to find a way to put his consciousness in a place where he can respond to his destiny without attachment to the result. It's not like Krishna says, here's a way to get around this. Here's a way to make it work so that everyone lives happily ever after. He's not solving Arjuna's problem on the level that Arjuna has asked his questions. He's assuring Arjuna, in fact, that everything that he thinks will happen will in fact happen. And still, he has to go through with this. There's no way around it. He has to go through it. And Krishna is teaching Arjuna how to go through it, and by extension, teaching us how to go through situations for which there is no desirable material outcome in store for us. And here's the payoff, though. For by acting without attachment, one surely attains the highest perfection. Now, this is really significant. To a good person or to someone who values nonviolence, let's say, that's a personal attachment. But action on behalf of the supreme being, or action in accordance with divine will, without attachment to the result, is understood to be perfect action. In other words, to coordinate or to sublimate one's own desires for a higher purpose. Now, this is not the same thing. This sounds immediately, and this is a real deal breaker for a lot of people with the Bhagavad-gita, because this sounds suspiciously like an endorsement of the kind of religious warfare that nobody wants. In fact, it's the kind of thing that's going on in Yemen. And it's not. And the reason it's not is because there's no attachment to a material result. All of this religious warfare that we experience, religiously motivated warfare, if you look at it, there's a result that's desired by the combatants, one side or the other, that is clearly tainted by a material conception of life, or a material, very kind of terrestrial sort of religion or divinity. And that is not, I assure you, what Krishna is talking about here, nor is it the kind of thing that he is encouraging Arjuna to engage in. Krishna is not a religious fanatic, and he is not encouraging religious fanaticism in Arjuna in the course of trying to convince him to fight this particular battle. We'll go a little deeper into this as a moral issue, an ethical question that comes up in the Bhagavad-gita as we proceed. So it's not like I'm just going to drop the whole issue right here in case you feel like there's more to it, and I'll bet that you do. Okay. Our last verse. Now, Arjuna might have the same question you have, which is, has anyone ever done this? Has anyone actually ever achieved the highest perfection by fighting without attachments to the results? And this is how this last verse in this cluster makes sense. Verse 20, indeed, by proper action alone, kings like Janaka attained perfection. Janaka is a king who appears in the other of the two epics of Indian literature, the Ramayana. He is the father of Janaki, who is, which is another name for Sita, the beloved of Ram. So if you read about Sita and Ram, the wanderings of Sita and Ram in the Ramayana, that's who Krishna is referring to here, just so you know who this person is. If for no other reason, you are obliged to act for the welfare of the world. Now that sounds a little weird considering that just by the battle taking place, the whole society is going to go to hell in a handbasket. So now we've got a cliffhanger, because how this is so will be explained in the following verses. Okay, so here's what we covered. The art of sacrifice, participating in the cycles of nature, who actually can act independently, namely the Atma-Rama, someone who is not pursuing action for the sake of a material reward, action for the benefit of others. We are just now touching on the idea that action with detachment provides a better example for the world than just reclusive contemplation alone. Arjuna is famous, and Janaki, within the culture of the Indian epics, is also famous. So Krishna is using Janaki as an example of how someone actually did attain perfection by fighting without attachment to the results. And therefore Arjuna should also set a proper example for others to follow, since he is famous and people will look up to him. And then in the next set of verses, we're going to really go deeper into this aspect of exemplary behavior for that ultimately benefits others. Okay, we've got just another few minutes left in our time together this evening. Any further questions that you have, I of course will be very happy to field them. And while I am waiting for you to ask me a question, I want to give a special shout out to my friends in Lawrence, Kansas and vicinity. I had a wonderful, wonderful time out there this past extended weekend. Here I am with Gopi Mata in front of her yogashala right on her wonderful Bhaktivana farm. And I just wanted to let you know how much I really appreciated your wonderful hospitality and what a great time I had spending time with you. Question from one such friend. Which translation are you using for this meeting? I'm using my own translation for this meeting. I am taking about a half dozen different editions of the Bhagavad-gita that I find are good translations in one way or another, but may have, as I referenced earlier, some thing that I wish was a little better, a little clearer or such. So rather than use any one translation from a publication, from an edition that's of the Bhagavad-gita that's out there, I'm using my own translation, and I encourage you to bring any of your translations or all of your translations, if you have more than one, to this webinar. There is great value to be gained by comparing different translations and different commentaries. And I own probably a dozen Bhagavad-gitas, some of which I would never recommend, but it's good to know what they are and what they say anyway. But having a handful of Bhagavad-gitas and comparing them, very, very, very useful thing to do. If you go to my website, I have under books, I have a bookshelf, and you can also see a few editions of the Bhagavad-gita that are sitting on my physical bookshelf that are on my website, and you can take a look at those to see if you would like to add those editions of the Bhagavad-gita to your collection. You can tell me, actually, if you don't have, I don't see any other questions here, so tell me, which edition of the Bhagavad-gita are you reading? Please type it into the question box so that I know translation by so-and-so, or which ones are you reading? We have just a couple of minutes left. We have 1 minute. Type quickly. While you are quickly typing the edition of the Bhagavad-gita that you are referencing as we go through this webinar, thank you very much. So yeah, the Graham Schwag translation, Swami Pradavananda's translation. Any questions after the fact? You know where to find me. Hari@hari-kirtana.com. So please keep those cards and letters coming in. I've been hearing from many of you offline, and it's been wonderful to get your emails, and I'm always really, really jazzed to hear from you after the fact. And also the many of you who I know are listening or watching this webinar in its recorded incarnation. I'm very, very happy to hear your questions as well. It's been great to hear from you. Please keep those cards and letters coming in. Thea, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, a very recommended edition. I used a couple of excerpts from Srila Prabhupada's purports in my references this evening. Just a couple of quick upcoming events. I am currently engaged with my friend Adam Ellenbaas at Nightlight Astrology. Thursday nights before this webinar, I am on his website doing a talk, a 4-part series on the Bhagavad-gita as it relates to astrology. So you can find out more by going to his website, nightlightastrology.com /upcoming events, and check that out if you like. This Saturday, June 16th, 1 o'clock, I will be at Sky House Yoga for the Q&A info session for my advanced yoga teacher training that I'm doing with Ashley Lateki Ellenbaas at Sky House Yoga. Our faculty will be there. If you're in the Silver Spring area, which includes parts of Texas and British Columbia, please fly in and join us for this info session if you'd like to find out more about the training. I am very happy to be returning to Cumberland, Maryland in just a couple of weeks for a meditation immersion weekend. So please make plans to join me for that if you are in the Cumberland, Frostburg area next week. We move on to Karma Yoga. We circle back to this topic of exemplary action and Krishna, his own personal example of dutiful action. If what you're doing is not perceived as helping, maybe it's not helping. So we also spoke just a little bit, or I foreshadowed a little bit of that. We're going to cover chapter 3, verses 21 through 26. So another small cluster of verses that we will go into deeply. And that's all, folks. Thank you very, very much for spending your time with me. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to being back here next Thursday night, same time, same channel, and I hope to see you all then. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you for sticking around a couple of minutes after the fact, and I'll see you next time. You're welcome, Susan. Nice to see you. Okay. Ending meeting for all. See you next time.